actually founded Christianity?
You know, if you ask that in a Sunday school class, you get one answer. But if you ask it in a university history department, you get a very different one.
Right. Most people on the street would probably say Jesus of Nazareth,
Huh?
obviously. But if you talk to a secular historian, someone, analyzing the Roman Empire without a theological dog in the fight, they often point somewhere else. They point to Paul.
It is the elephant in the room of biblical history. It really is. And it makes people uncomfortable. But historically, you just can't tell the story of how this faith survived without putting Paul in the driver's seat.
And that is exactly what we're unpacking today. We're doing a deep dive into a set of sources that take what they call a biblical humanities approach. We are not doing the stained glass window version of history today.
Yep.
We're stripping that all away to look at the dust, the insults, the slave markets, and the brutal economics of the first century.
It's a gritty reality. The Paul we find in these sources, he isn't the polite saint you see in Renaissance paintings. This is a man fighting a desperate war for the survival of a movement that was really on the verge of extinction.
To do that, he had to say things that sound shocking to modern ears. We're going to talk about vipers. We're going to calculate the actual cash value of a human soul in cows, seriously, cows. And we are going to fundamentally redefine a word that gets thrown around in church constantly, the law.
And a fair warning to you listening, our source material is extremely specific about the language we need to use here. We are not going to use the soft sort of religious word covenant today. The source insists that the accurate translation for the legal dynamic at play here is a contract.
A contract. That feels, I don't know, cold. It sounds like something I sign at a car dealership, not a spiritual agreement.
It sounds cold, I agree. But it is accurate. A contract has terms. It has parties. It has penalties. If you soften it to covenant, you miss the legal weight of what Paul is actually arguing.
Yeah.
So we're sticking with contract.
Okay, I'm on board. Let's get into it. But before we can even get to Paul, the source material says we have to start with the man who started the fire, Jesus. Because the argument here is that Jesus wasn't just a nice teacher who wanted everyone to get along. He was on a collision course.
Oh, it was a head-on collision. There's this popular idea that Jesus was just, tweaking the rules, trying to make Judaism a little friendlier or more accessible. But if you look at the text, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, he does something incredibly audacious. He uses this formula over and over. You have heard it said, but I say to you.
Which, in that context, is a massive power move.
A direct challenge to authority. He is quoting the Torah, the established law of the land, the foundation of their entire society, and saying, that interpretation you have, it's wrong. Here is the reality. He isn't suggesting an edit. He is overruling the Supreme Court of his day.
Give us an example of this, because I think we gloss over how truly radical this was.
Okay, take the commandment, do not murder. The religious establishment, the Pharisees, they took this very literally. As long as you don't physically end someone's life, you're good.
Check the box.
You've kept the law, you get a gold star for the day.
Which seems like a pretty low bar. I didn't kill anyone today. Great job, me.
Exactly. But Jesus reinterprets it. He says murder isn't just the physical act, it's the internal intent. It includes what the source calls mental murder. If you despise someone, if you ignore the weak, if you treat a human being like they don't exist in the eyes of the contract, that is murder.
That is a much, much harder standard. You can't just checklist your way through that one.
You absolutely cannot. And this is why he clashed so violently with the Pharisees. Our source highlights the shocking language Jesus used. He didn't just disagree with them politely. He called them snakes, a brood of vipers, and sons of the devil.
It feels incredibly harsh. I mean, these were the pastors of the day, right? The respected community leaders. Why so much aggression? Why the insults?
Well, you have to understand the sociology of that specific moment. In that society, religion was the last bastion. The political system was corrupt. The Romans ran that, and they were brutal. The economic system was broken. So if the government fails and the economy fails, you still have family. If the family fails, you have religion.
It's the final support beam.
It is the final support beam for the entire culture. It's the safety net.
Right.
But what if religion is corrupt? What if the people holding the keys to knowledge are locking the doors? If the safety net is full of holes,
Then there's nowhere left to go. The society just collapses.
precisely. Jesus accused them of standing in the doorway. They wouldn't go in themselves, and they stopped everyone else from entering. He viewed his mission not just as saving souls in a vacuum, but as shattering a broken religious system that was suffocating people. He wasn't trying to patch it up. He was dismantling it to save the world from despair.
So he clears the ground, he creates this explosion in Jerusalem, but then, historically speaking, the movement should have died right there, shouldn't it?
It should have. Most messianic movements in the first century flared up, the leader was killed, and the followers just dispersed. It happened all the time.
So this brings us back to Paul. Why do the historians call him the founder?
It really comes down to survival and export. Without Paul, the movement Jesus started would have likely remained a small, obscure Jewish sect. It would have stayed in Jerusalem, followed the local laws, and then, when the Romans crushed Jerusalem in 70 AD, it might have been wiped off the map entirely.
So Paul is the distribution network.
He's the translator. He took this very specific Jewish message and translated it for the global Roman world. And here's where the source makes a claim that I found fascinating. It says secular historians often understand Paul better than theologians do.
That seems completely backward. You'd think the theologians would be the experts. They spend their whole lives studying this stuff.
The problem is the bubble. Theologians are often reading Paul through the lens of their specific tradition, Lutheran, Catholic, Calvinist. They're reading backwards from their current beliefs. Historians are outside the bubble. They're just looking at the map. They see Paul fighting a war on two fronts. And the biggest threat wasn't the Romans.
It wasn't the persecution. I always picture the lions and the Colosseums.
That came later. In the beginning, the source is very, very emphatic. The biggest threat to the early church was internal. It was the different gospel Paul talks about in his letter to the Galatians.
I've heard that phrase. I always assumed the different gospel was, I don't know, paganism or maybe atheism, some other religion entirely.
No, and this is the key to understanding everything Paul wrote. The different gospel was coming from inside the house. It was a group inside the church who believed in Jesus, yes, but they couldn't let go of their old system. They wanted to keep the exclusive Jewish rituals. They were trying to mix the new wine into old wineskins.
So they wanted Jesus plus the old rules.
Exactly. They wanted Jesus, but you still had to eat kosher. You still had to be circumcised. You still had to follow the calendar. Paul saw so clearly that if they did that, the whole movement would collapse. It would cease to be a universal faith for the world and just become a private Jewish club again.
This leads us to the phrase that has probably caused 500 years of arguments, works of the law.
The big one.
Paul rails against it. He says you cannot be saved by works of the law. Now, growing up, I heard this and thought, okay, so doing good things doesn't matter. I just need to believe.
And that is the tragedy of bad translation. Our source just screams against this interpretation. To understand what Paul means by works, you have to understand the intertestamental period.
Okay, pause there. Intertestamental period. Break that down for us quickly.
It's simply the gap between the Old Testament ending and the New Testament beginning. It's about 400 years. It's silence in the Bible, but there was a lot of noise in history. During that time, the Jewish people were under attack by Greek culture Hellenism.
Alexander the Great and all that.
Right. The Greeks didn't just want to conquer land. They wanted to conquer culture. They wanted everyone to look Greek, speak Greek, and think Greek. If you were a Jewish person in that era, you felt like your entire identity was being erased.
So they had to build a wall.
They built a cultural wall. To survive, they doubled down on specific identity markers, cultural badges to prove they were distinct. These are what Paul calls works of the law.
So this is a crucial distinction. When he says works, he isn't talking about do not steal or do not murder.
No, not at all. He's talking about things like strict Sabbath rules, dietary restrictions, and purification rites, the things that made a Jew look different from a Greek.
Wait, so when Paul says works don't save you, he essentially means your cultural rituals don't save you.
Yes, he is saying your ethnicity and your cultural badges are not a ticket to God. The source gives a fascinating modern example to illustrate how intense these works can get. It mentions a student in Israel observing Orthodox customs. He was in class on the Sabbath, he started taking notes, and someone poked him.
Poked him. Physically.
Yes. Why? Because writing is creating. It's considered work. So he put the pen away. Then he got poked again for carrying the pen in his pocket. Carrying a tool is work.
That seems incredibly granular.
It goes even further. Today, there are elevators in Israel programmed to stop at every single floor on the Sabbath so you don't have to press a button.
You're kidding me?
No, because pressing a button closes a circuit. That creates a spark. A spark is fire. And lighting a fire is work.
So waiting 10 minutes for the elevator to hit every single floor is righteousness.
In that specific interpretation of works of the law, yes. It is about maintaining the boundary. And this is what Paul is fighting. He is arguing that keeping these specific culturally defensive rituals, these badges of Jewishness, cannot save you. He's not saying that moral goodness is irrelevant. He is saying that your elevator buttons are not your ticket to salvation.
That really flips the script. It isn't faith versus good deeds. It is faith versus cultural exclusivity.
Correct. And if you miss that, you turn Paul into someone who says, don't bother being a good person, which is the absolute opposite of what he actually taught.
But this creates a vacuum. If the elevator button doesn't save you and the dietary laws don't save you, what does? We have to talk about the mechanism of salvation. And the source uses some language here that I found really gritty. It talks about economics.
It's the language of the slave market. We use terms like redemption or ransom in church, and we treat them like spiritual poetry. We forget what they actually meant to a first-century listener. These were financial terms, hard currency.
So break it down for me. What is the market value of a human being in this context?
Well, in the ancient world, a slave was worth roughly 5 cows or 5 horses.
5 cows. Okay, for a modern listener, that sounds random. But in an agrarian society,
That is a fortune. That represents years of labor, breeding, resources. It is massive capital.
Yeah.
And here is the problem. A slave has no assets. A slave owns nothing. So if you are a slave to sin, which is the metaphor Paul uses, you are effectively bankrupt. You owe a debt of 5 cows, but your pockets are completely empty.
you can't buy your own freedom. It's mathematically impossible.
You cannot. And the source takes it even deeper. Paul says the wages of sin is death. So the debt isn't just money, it is life. You owe a life.
Yeah.
Money can't pay a death debt. Only a life can pay for a life.
This is where the concept of God's righteousness comes in, right? I think people hear righteousness and just think God is nice or something.
It's so much more active than that. God's righteousness or God's justice is God stepping in to balance the books because humanity is insolvent.
Yeah.
The source explains it like this. God became human in Jesus to pay the body price.
The body price. That's a heavy phrase.
It is literal in this context. To pay the ransom of a slave, you need a matching value. Jesus lived the human life and then died the specific death of a slave crucifixion. We have to remember, crucifixion wasn't just a painful way to die. It was a status symbol. It was the punishment reserved for rebels and slaves. He died the slave's death to pay the slave's ransom.
So the debt is paid, the bankruptcy is filed, we are free.
We are free.
So now what? And I think this is where the modern mind gets really stuck. If the price is paid, if the check cleared, do we just sit back, relax, and wait for heaven? Do we do nothing?
This is maybe the most dangerous misunderstanding in modern Christianity. It is what our source calls cheap grace.
Cheap grace, meaning I'm saved so it doesn't matter how I live.
Right. And this brings us back to that word we promised to use, the contract. Paul isn't saying the debt is paid, go do whatever you want. He is saying the ritual law, the elevator buttons, the hand washing, that is gone. But the Sinai contract remains.
The Sinai contract, you mean the 10 Commandments, the moral stuff.
The moral law, the law of love. The source is very, very strong in this distinction. We have to distinguish between the articles of the law, the rituals, and the contract of the law, which is the binding moral obligation to love God and neighbor.
But hold on. We just established that humans are bankrupt. We just said we are slaves to sin. If we couldn't keep the contract before, how can we possibly keep it now? Won't we just fail again?
And that is the crucial question. If the gospel stopped at forgiveness, we would just be in a cycle of failing and being forgiven, failing and being forgiven.
Which honestly describes a lot of people's experience.
It does, but that is incomplete. This is where the Holy Spirit enters the equation. Salvation has 2 parts. Part 1, the ransom. You are forgiven. The debt is cleared. Part 2, empowerment.
Empowerment, meaning what, practically?
Meaning you are given the Holy Spirit not just as a comfort or a warm, fuzzy feeling during a song. It is a power source. It is capital. The Spirit enables you to actually fulfill the contract.
So it isn't that the bar is lowered. It isn't that God says, oh, don't worry about being good. It's that you're given the strength to finally jump over the bar.
Precisely. Think about the fruit of the Spirit Paul talks about. Love, joy, peace, patience. These are not just nice personality traits he hopes you develop. They are the evidence that you are keeping the contract. Paul isn't saying works don't matter. He is saying you can't do these works on your own power, and empty rituals won't help you. But with the Spirit, you can live out the contract of love.
That's a huge shift. It moves the focus from what rules am I following to what power is driving my life.
It creates a religion that is not about checking boxes. I went to church, I didn't drink, I didn't curse. but about a transformation of character. It's about actually becoming the kind of person who fulfills the law, not because you're afraid of punishment, but because your very nature has been changed.
It really recontextualizes everything. We started this deep dive talking about insults and vipers and history, and we ended up in a slave market realizing our debt was paid. But it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
No, it is a transfer of ownership. You aren't a slave to sin anymore. You're a servant of the contract.
That connects the dots for me. The works of the law were just human attempts to look righteous from the outside. The contract is actual righteousness from the inside out.
Exactly. We traded the elevator button for actual love.
Which brings us to the takeaway. Because it is so easy to look back at the Pharisees or the first century legalists and judge them. We think, oh, how silly, they wouldn't carry a pen on the Sabbath. We laugh at the elevator thing. But the source leaves us with a really provocative question for today.
What's that?
What are our elevator buttons?
Really is the question.
What are the cultural badges or the Christian rituals that we cling to today? Do we think we're good because we go to a specific building on Sunday? Or because we vote for a specific political party? Or because we listen to a certain genre of music?
Or because we use the right religious slang?
Right. Are we clutching our own works of the law, our own little identity markers, thinking they make us righteous, while completely missing the actual contract? Are we ignoring the neighbor standing right in front of us because we're too busy polishing our badges?
It's a difference between looking religious and being loving. And that is a question that should keep us up at night. Are we living by the contract? Or just playing a new version of the old game?
A lot to chew on. We'll leave it there for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.